Ladies and gentlemen, dear Professor Benz, dear speakers, dear colleagues, and dear audience in front of the screens. Today is the 8th of April 2025, and I warmly welcome you at the Federal Foundation for the Reappraisal of the SED Dictatorship for opening the conference Experience, Memory and Instrumentalisation, the Long End of the War in Europe. I am delighted by the great response and by the fact that so many of you have come here today. My name is Amelie zu Eulenburg and I head the Memorials and Remembrance Culture Department at the Federal Foundation. On behalf of our cooperation partners, the Bundeswehr Center for Military History and Social Sciences, the German-Polish House, the Foundation Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, and the Museum Berlin-Karlshorst, I would like to warmly welcome you to the keynote address and the opening event. The fact that so many of you have come tonight shows how significant this moment is. 80 years lie between today and the end of the war, and this gives us an occasion to discuss together what the end of the war meant in the cultures of remembrance of the various European states, and what it means in the present. After World War II, almost nothing was as it was before. During the 6 years of the war, which lasted from September 1939 to September 1945, more than 66 million people worldwide lost their lives. This is almost 1 million people per month, and it corresponds to 3.5% of the world's population at that time. They lost their lives in military operations, on land, at sea and in the air, but also as a result of war crimes or expulsion. 6 million European Jews fell victim to the racial and extermination mania of the Nazis, the systematic mass murder that the Germans waged in Eastern and Southeastern Europe also almost eliminated a centuries-old tradition of Jewish life in Europe. 220,000 Sinti and Roma became victims of the genocide committed by the Nazis. and many more people were persecuted and killed. By the end of the war, the Soviet Union alone had suffered 25 million deaths. Across Europe, millions more had lost their homes because they had to flee, were expelled, or were subjected to resettlement policies based on racial ideology. Among those who were uprooted, there were almost 8 million forced laborers in the German Reich. By the end of World War II, large parts of Europe lay in ruins. In August 1945, nuclear bombs were thrown on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was the first time that nuclear weapons were used in a targeted way. At our conference in the coming 2 days, we want to discuss questions that are still controversial today. On the one hand, this includes the end of the war as a turning point in the history of violence and as the beginning of a long post-war period. The political consequences can still be felt today. The conference is dedicated to the manifold political and social consequences of the end of the war. It highlights how liberation and occupation overlapped in Europe from 1945 onwards and how this experience continues to affect collective memories. The conference asks what misunderstandings and myths are associated with the year 1945. How is this history currently narrated in public? What landscapes of memory will we pass on to future generations, and how diverse and complex are European societies reflected in them? Democratic societies need diverse and creative debates and forms of remembrance in the public sphere. But how much do we know about the cultures of remembrance in our neighboring countries? What challenges exist? How do European societies deal with gaps, with open questions, and the rewriting of history? The year 1945 cannot be commemorated without talking about the Holocaust, about genocidal violence, and the consequences of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. It requires a differentiated examination, both of the military end of the war and of the newly created borders in Europe, where in the Stalinist sphere of influence the beginning of the Cold War was prepared. The 8th of May 1945 is a crucial date in Europe. Not a day for celebration, but a day of liberation, as Federal President Richard von Weizsäcker said in his much-quoted speech in 1985. But with the turning point of 1989, intense memory conflicts emerged. And 1945 has ambivalent connotations in the national memories of Western, Central and Eastern Europe. To what extent is 1945 suitable as a European place of remembrance? 1945, did it mean liberation, catastrophe, collapse, victis' justice, democratization, economic miracle, or a seamless transition from one dictatorship to the next, from successive foreign occupations, multiple experiences of violence, repression and persecution? 1945, it means controversial perspectives. On the one hand, there was the so-called Treason of Yalta, a consensus on the criminal nature of the National Socialist War of Aggression and the German occupation and extermination policy. On the other hand, the Holocaust had to be dealt with, although in many countries it appears to be unconnected to one's own national history. And then there was also the reception of Soviet occupation and of what is frequently contrasted with an Eastern Gulag memory. The year 1945 remains a focal point to this day. After the turning point of 1989, however, another one has emerged, the year 2022. The Russian war of aggression against Ukraine puts many assumptions and interpretations to the test. What does the year 2022 mean for the different European cultures of remembrance and for the perspectives on the year 1945? How can the struggle for a prerogative of interpretation or for diverse interpretations be discussed? How can we approach the topic in the face of parallel crises, inflation, war, refugee movements and new authoritarian states? It is good that there's a broadly accepted culture of constructive debate here about what, where and when we should remember and who is supposed to remember. The debate about the end of the war is an opportunity to talk about Europe, about traumas, mourning the beginning of new dictatorships and the myth of liberation and reconciliation. In light of the end of the war, what unites and what divides us? Which perspectives make the debate more complicated and which perspectives are helpful? I would like to thank our cooperation partners and particularly the colleagues who planned and designed this conference in the past months. These are Julia Borg and Adam Kerbel-Fronius of the Foundation Denkmal, Robert Parzer of the German-Polish House, Jörg Moret of the Museum Berlin-Karlshorst, Christiane Jannecke and Frank Reichertzer of the Bundeswehr Center for Military History and Social Sciences, and Samuel da Silva of the Federal Foundation for the Reappraisal of the SED Dictatorship. Thank you very much. Sometimes days pass in a different way than you expect. And it is a particular honor to me to greet Professor Wolfgang Benz, one of the most important contemporary historians of the Federal Republic. He came from the Institute of Contemporary History of Munich, and in 1990 he became the director of the Center for Anti-Semitism Research at the Technical University of Berlin. At that time, he was one of the most important scholars writing on National Socialism, Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and cultures of remembrance, and many of his publications have become standard references. Until today, he participates in discussions about historical policy, genocide research, and cultures of remembrance. His latest book, Exile, A History of Expulsion, was published just 6 weeks ago. Dear Professor Benz, this morning you still didn't know that you would be lucky to speak to us tonight, and I'm very happy that you agreed to step in for the keynote, which gives the framework for this conference and for the coming 3 days. We were really lucky that you stepped in. We are very grateful to you. And now, Mr. Benz, I pass the floor to you.
Einen schönen guten.
A very good evening. Now you know a bit of the story, and of course there's a difference. If a young musician learns in the morning that he'll have the opportunity to sing the Valkyrie or Tannhäuser, something long and complicated, or be the conductor, then of course this young musician would be delighted. If, on the other hand, it is an old or an ancient historian who learns in the morning that on the same evening he'll be delivering a keynote speech, then this is a different matter altogether, because the old historian can't gain anything from this. His career is well behind him. He can only lose, really, if instead of the intellectual, high-flying words that mark the beginning of the conference, are really only simple matters he'll be able to report on. Thankfully, when I was young, I was one of the first people who looked at post-war history, so the history after 1945 in Germany. That has long been forgotten, but this is what makes it possible for me to agree to a keynote like this one this evening. I am not completely blank on the subject matter as far as cultures of remembrance are concerned and the policies of remembrance is concerned after the Holocaust. Nonetheless, please be disappointed, but don't let me feel it too badly, please. The title of my improvisation is Defeat or Liberation, the End of the Third Reich in the Memory of Germans. anything else, the big topic, Europe, the myths, or countering the myths and presenting future perspectives on the fate of Europe, well, that is really then up to the colleagues who'll be joining the conference from tomorrow. So please tonight bear with a generalist and old historian who maybe will tell you what you already know, but which might be worth knowing nonetheless. Okay, the year 1945 has long been understood as a year of disaster, as the final of the war, but also as the forceful end of a state and societal order which one had, at least in Germany, somehow gotten used to. The terrors of war continued to be felt, and the consequences could not be overlooked. There were prisoners of war, streams of refugees, destroyed cities, hunger, homelessness, and fear. There was occupation by Allied troops, which signified impotence and humiliation up until the last corners of everyday life. All of that played its part in registering the end of the war and violent rule, mostly as a period of ruins, a time of ruins and hunger. It wasn't really understood as a period of liberation and a new start. Hunger, cold, being afraid of the soldiers of the Red Army, but also being afraid of the French, the Brits and Americans who came across as triumphant winners of the war and not as liberators, because they couldn't really differentiate between the Nazis, their opponents, and the sheer mass of those who were indifferent. As a consequence, they determined a climate of new suppression in everyday life. The arbitrariness of suppression, which was understood as a dictatorship of education, but also as a colonialist period, as a kind of exploitative occupation, all of those factors made people feel the loss of the war in a painful way. But of course, there was also plenty of reason for Germans to pity themselves. They had lost their regions in the east, the fate of German prisoners of war, the loss of employment because of the loss of the armaments industry and industry generally. Lots of equipment had been transported off into other countries as part of reparation payments. Officials were interned, and former members of the NSDAP were not allowed to work. All of this was perceived as a consequence of the war, alongside the destroyed cities, were perceived as a consequence of a war that the Allies had won. The everyday struggle to survive, worrying about family members, worrying about where to sleep and where to find food, didn't leave much time for reflection on the causes of the lost war, how that war had begun, and how there had been continuous support that had kept Hitler in power up to the very last. The famous speech of Federal President Richard von Weizsäcker, held on 8th of May 1985, was a turning point, but not a breakthrough. Weizsäcker said, "We mustn't separate the 8th of May 1945 from 30th of January 1933. 40 years after the end of the Third Reich challenged Germany to take on responsibility for what had been joyous support of Hitler and the support of the majority for getting rid of democracy." Weizsäcker called upon individual suffering that war had brought, and the end of the war had brought for many, and related it to responsibility for its causes, namely the National Socialist movement of Adolf Hitler that had come to power in 1933, supported by German citizens. He said, and I quote, "The 8th of May was a day of liberation. It liberated all of us from a system of National Socialist rule of force. Nobody will forget, for the sake of this liberation, what terrible suffering began for many with the 8th of May and followed. But in the end of the war, we mustn't see the cause for flight, expulsion and lack of freedom. That can be found in its beginning, or the beginning of this rule of force that led Germany into war. So for conservative patriots, this was difficult to stomach in 1985. Today, another 40 years later, the understanding that the military defeat and the political failure of the Nazi regime had paved the way for democracy is threatened once again. It was inconceivable in 1985 when Weizsäcker spoke that a radical political party would have 20% of all mandates in the German Bundestag and would use those mandates to deny historical facts in order to return to ideas of nationalism and in order to preach exclusionary hatred and stigmatizing foreigners in inverted commas. As a late consequence of German unity, on the territory of the former socialist state of the GDR, we do see a wide-ranging spread of right-wing extremism. It is fired by right-wing extremist demagogues, and those who are dissatisfied are questioning the state model of democracy. They cheer a kind of revival of fascist phrases presented by the AfD political party. The defeat of 1945 not only brought liberation from the Nazi regime, it opened up a possibility to have a second go at democracy in Germany. This began during a period of occupation under very difficult prerequisites. 3 Western zones were characterized by a freedom-based parliamentary democracy, and it was practiced by the occupying powers. In the Soviet zone, on the other hand, the model was an anti-fascist democratic revolution, and the GDR arose from this as a socialist counter-model to the Federal Republic of Germany. Germany was divided into 4 zones and governed by military governments of Great Britain, France, the United States and the Soviet Union. The methods and objectives were quite different. Germany's territory, of course, was much smaller than it had been before the war. After the capitulation of the Wehrmacht on the 8th of May 1945, Germany lost every right of a sovereign state. With the capitulation of the Wehrmacht, and above all, with the Berlin Declaration of the 5th of June 1945, the 4 military rulers of the Allied forces were the supreme government in Germany. The Deutsche Reich ceased to exist at that point as a state. The end of Nazi rule was overshadowed by the military agony of the German Reich. It was also overshadowed by the end time of National Socialism, which in the last months of the Third Reich still committed horrendous crimes with huge numbers of victims and dead. Under the bombardment of the British and American Air Force, German large cities perished under the rubble of these cities. Many thousand people lay dead. People were fleeing the Red Army, which was coming into the country via Eastern Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania, reaching Berlin in April 1945 and occupying it. The flight was followed by expulsion, which was agreed in summer 1945 at the Potsdam Conference of the three major powers, the Soviet Union, the United States and Great Britain. After losing its eastern territories, which were given to Poland and the Soviet Union, the idea was that Germany should never ever be able to kick off another ethnic war. This is why Germans were driven out of the Sudetenland and other regions of Czechoslovakia. They were driven out of Hungary, where they'd been living for centuries. In the territory that was left over from the Deutsche Reich, it was occupied and administered by the Allies. People were suffering from hunger, they had nowhere to live, they were desperate. Spring 1945 was therefore remembered mostly as the terrible end of the Second World War and not so much as a period of liberation. The events of the war had been so dramatic and had threatened existences so much. They had affected life of every single person so much that it was incomparable to what the policy of National Socialist regime had been able to do.
In the remembrance of the contemporaries, the year 1945 was perceived as a year of catastrophes, as the final year of the war, but also as the end of a state order and a social order that many people opposed, who didn't show it. People who had felt an inner resistance, which they realized only in 1945 and talked about it in the years to come. Germans were used to orders and following orders. However, now it was soldiers in American or Soviet uniforms telling them what to do. And French and British soldiers gave them orders or did not fulfill their requests. And many Germans disliked that. It was particularly humiliating for the Germans who had become used to the racial ideology of the Nazis, that in the occupying forces there were soldiers which had a black color of skin, and that they were superior to them. Many Germans felt despair about the loss of relatives, the loss of property, and for many it was also a loss of career and occupation. But there was also a feeling of shame about what Germans had to understand: the atrocities of concentration camps, the murder of millions of Jews, the racial and extermination war against Sinti and Roma, against Slavonic peoples, against the civilian population of the occupied territories. These were things that did not fit to the understanding of the German cultural nation, but that had happened on behalf of the Germans. Of course, the majority of Germans knew what was going on in the concentration and extermination camps. The Germans also knew what happened in the occupied countries, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, the Baltic states, on behalf of the racial ideology. However, the Germans did not know that openly. They looked away and delegated responsibility to a minority of perpetrators, and thus wanted to keep free from the guilt of knowing. And this looking away had two goals. On the one hand, the Germans did not want to feel a collective guilt, and on the other hand, they kept saying that they didn't know anything about the murderous side of the regime. It was just a small group of criminals that had received power over Germany and misused it. The thesis of collective guilt existed only in the imagination of Germans. It was never the reason for any actions of the Allied forces. On the contrary, denazification and trials against criminals of war always dealt only with the individual guilt of individuals. The necessity of the democratization and demilitarization of Germany did not need this reasoning of a collective guilt of the Germans. The German power elites had given rise to a catastrophe, and that was enough. So maybe the thesis of collective guilt was just a German imagination. And many people kept saying that they didn't know anything about the crimes of the regime. This became the life lie of at least one generation. The end of the war in May 1945 was perceived by the majority of Germans very happily, but they, of course, were physically exhausted. They saw that other Germans and other party members had followed an ideological fanatism and patriotism, and that they, of course, this way had lost the hopes for a final victory and rule over Europe. Germans were exhausted and disappointed. Germans were united in their suffering because of their fallen fathers, brothers and sons. And they were longing for peace because this meant security for them. It meant food and a home. It meant no more propaganda. The military defeat was a fact that could be felt immediately by the occupation forces and their behavior. Brits and French presented themselves as colonial rulers. The Americans, again, presented themselves as rich victors, however, with very strong morals, and the soldiers of the Red Army were perceived as representatives of the goddess of revenge, Nemesis. They were killing, they were raping and looting. And for many, it was very difficult for many Germans, it was very difficult to perceive the collapse of the Nazi regime as a liberation. Occupation was a foreign rule, and the humiliation that was asked from the Germans was perceived as injustice by many of them. Many said they didn't know. Many said they had forgotten about the enthusiasm that was present in 1933. And many said they had forgotten that they supported the Hitler state. Many, in fact, had supported it passively. And now there was also the feeling that the measures of the occupation did injustice to many individual people. Many Germans said they were not personally torturing others or killing others. And this feeling of belonging to a superior race and the feeling that Goebbels had given the Germans that they were superior, this feeling had still not left the people. And when they saw Afro-American soldiers who were living under very good conditions, or when they saw the uncivilized Russians that did not know how to use a toilet, this gave rise to a lot of negative sentiments. The material need and the fear of losing more relatives gave very little way for more reflection. Political opponents of National Socialism, of course, felt that they were liberated. However, this circle of people was not dealt with by the victors in a different way than the other Germans. They were all perceived as Nazis. They were all perceived as supporters of Hitler. Diaries, memories, and letters reflect the feelings of the first hours after the end of National Socialism. The journalist Ruth Andreas Friedrich from Berlin had participated in the group Onkel Emil. It was a resistance group against the Nazis. The day of the German surrender was a day which she described as a day of enthusiasm. She writes, "We are now free of bombs, free of the Gestapo, free of Nazis. We run home and have a party in the evening. We party with everything we have. Pax nobiscum." End of quote. Hildegard Hambrücher was 24 years old. She lived in Starnberg and had just finished her doctorate in March 1945 in chemistry. She was in opposition of the Nazi regime, and she writes of happiness on the 8th of May. She writes about people who did not belong to the opponents of the Nazis, but now said that they had always been against them, of course. End of quote. Later, she became a liberal politician, and she also remembers, quote, "I have never again in my life felt so intensively what it means to continue living, to be free without fear, but full of gratefulness and hoping for a better future." The author Erich Kästner, who was persecuted in the Third Reich, experienced the end of the war in Tyrol, and he saw with astonishment how quickly the Nazis adapted to the new time. A neighbor in Meyerhofen, for example, had just a few days ago still been very angry at a woman who had cried because her brother had died. And Erich Kästner wrote, "Yesterday he has thrown away his party badge and the picture of the Führer and other documents. He'll probably have a great career." For National Socialists who had been convinced Nazis in the Third Reich, it was more difficult. They had to get rid of their conviction, and they had to rethink, which was very difficult. They had to understand that they had followed the wrong ideology. Many realized that even though they had been forced to enter the Nazi party, they had always been very far away from the regime and had hated Hitler. Unfortunately, there was nothing that they were able to do. The Allies tried to support the Germans to get rid of this ideology by bringing them to the liberated concentration camps, by making them rethink in view of the large number of killed people. However, many remained silent. To the officers of the occupying forces who had absolute power over the Germans, this was a complete miracle. People from Silesia and Pomerania had lost their home. People from Eastern Prussia and the Sudetenland had to leave. There was an expulsion of millions of people who were deported by the victors, and that made the Germans question the image of the liberation of Germany. The refugees, the German refugees who came to their new home, this displacement meant that they were not welcome, that they were dealt with badly, and that their integration was just a forced integration by the occupying powers. This did not give rise to the sentiment that the ideology had been overcome, and it did not make people feel happy because they had got rid of the National Socialists. People suffered. More than 10 million people who were supposed to be Germans, but nobody understood them because they spoke strange dialects, had a right to get housing, a right that was implemented by the Allies. But even in the kitchens, they were preparing their food that smelled strangely for the other Germans. And this was all perceived as aliens entering a foreign world. Nobody wanted them. Everybody wanted to get rid of them. In the Adenauer era of the Federal Republic, historians were mostly interested, and Germans were mostly interested in German soldiers who were prisoners of war in the Soviet Union. The Chancellor Adenauer expressed the sentiment of a large majority of Western Germany when he declared in the German Bundestag on the 26th of October 1950 that the Soviet Union had just expressed cold cruelty, and probably there was about 1 million Germans in Soviet Russia, and of course also a large number, many millions of relatives in Germany who were experiencing pain and hopelessness. That was a quotation of Adenauer, and he also said that he didn't know whether in history there had ever been a time when so many people, millions of people, had been dealt with in such a cold and cruel way. It seems that he didn't know anything about how Germans had dealt with Soviet prisoners of war. The citizens of the Federal Republic of Germany were in shock in 1978. At that time, a dissertation was published under the title "No Comrades." In this dissertation, it was made public for the first time that prisoners of war of the German Wehrmacht were tortured to death in a targeted way. This was murder in more than 3 million cases. This was the PhD thesis of the young historian Christian Streit. It was published by the Munich Institute for Contemporary History, and it was widely received and discussed about. The conservative West German public, however, did not want to realize this truth. But it was not the empathy for the victims that made it angry, but the feeling that they had to get rid of a life lie. They were convinced that the Wehrmacht had been a decent army, had never committed any crimes, and was never part of the ideology of National Socialism.
years later, in 1995, the proponents of this proposal received a second and final shock through the Wehrmacht exhibition, which documented numerous crimes committed by the German armed forces. Crimes that had been delegated to that point to the SS and fanatical National Socialists. The Wehrmacht only lived soldierly virtues. This is what one wanted to believe, decades after the loss of the Third Reich. But also the citizens of the GDR that had to celebrate the liberation of fascism by the Soviet Union were not allowed to learn anything of the fate of the Red Armists in German captivity, because in the anti-fascist tales of liberation there was only room for victorious heroes and none for those that had been maltreated or murdered Soviet prisoners. In the culture of remembrance of the GDR, the soldiers of the Red Army remained heroes to the very last, who'd been anti-fascists and carried the main load of the struggle against Hitler's Germany. That is why they were honoured. For those that had suffered, had been injured, or had perished, there was no room in this imagery. The victory over German fascism and its allied, it was said, was the result of the joint struggle of all peoples of the anti-Hitler coalition. This is what was written in an official publication, which was published by the Central Institute for History of the Academy of Sciences of the GDR. They also said that it cannot be denied, I quote, that the Soviet Union had the greatest share of this. It not only suffered the heaviest losses, bore the main strain of the struggle, it was the Soviet Union's army that actually caused the decisive defeats of the fascist aggressors, end of quote. The image of the victorious Red Army was not to be tarnished by the fate of millions of those who had died in German camps. So who did feel liberated? Well, those who'd been imprisoned in concentration camps and other camps and prisons, those who had been classed as enemies of the Nazi regime and had waited for its end. Jews suddenly found themselves in camps for displaced persons and felt the old hatred. Political opponents and those who had resisted felt a sense of mistrust, which was also extended to those who had made it into exile. Those few who returned, Germans were not particularly friendly to. There wasn't a shared feeling of freedom. Some felt protected and at home in the camp of the victors. The others felt that the collapse after the war was primarily a disaster. The dislike procedure of denazification, which had been planned by the Allies long before the end of the war, and which was agreed at the Potsdam Conference in summer 1945, also did not contribute to a feeling of liberation when the National Socialist organization and structure came to an end. Bureaucracy, the dominance of the Allies, and also differences in how denazification was done made Germans rather suspect of this orderly political cleansing. So party members were divided into chief culprits and those who were just bystanders, and the punishments were according with those classifications. There's a famous book, of course, on this matter. It is called The Factory of Bystanders. Not sure of the English title. Okay. The ideology of National Socialism was discredited, but did not get rid of it completely. The Allied forces officially disbanded the NSDAP and prohibited every form of political parties with a similar content, but could not, of course, prevent old Nazis from sticking to their mindsets, and could also not prevent young people from finding these thoughts attractive. The GDR prohibited every form of organized right-wing extremism, which of course meant that right-wing extremism still existed, except that it was kind of secret, clandestine. But in the Federal Republic, right after its formal foundation, right-wing extremists suddenly found themselves back in organized sects and were part of the first Bundestag. The first Bundestag had 5 members of parliament of a German right-wing party, headed by someone who had been dismissed from being a teacher because of neo-Nazi statements. In October 1949, the so-called Socialist Reichspartei Party was founded, which also gained seats in regional elections. It kind of preempted its prohibition in October 1952 by dissolving itself. But numerous groupings, small parties, working groups continued in the tradition of right-wing extremism. In autumn 1964, this gave rise to the National Democratic Party of Germany, NPD, which again won some mandates in some of the regional parliaments. It was quite popular. It became more radical, but later on it lost significance. So this is really a predecessor of what we now know is the most successful right-wing party in Germany. You know that I'm avoiding calling them partly right-wing extremism, because I think if the party's leaders are right-wing extremists, then the whole party, in my view, should be classed as such. In the West, in the climate of the Cold War and in the confrontation with the GDR, a new feeling of superiority arose, which was supported or fed by the economic miracle after the German economic reform and the economic success of the Marshall Plan. Monetary reforms of 1948 were based on plans of the Western Allies. The Allies pushed them through against German concerns. This was soon forgotten when this policy was successful. It was also forgotten that it was, in fact, US taxpayers who financed the economic rebuilding of Western Europe as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. The economic success of the young Federal Republic was connotated with a German Tüchtigkeit, and the Germans lost sight of the feeling they had following the defeat. But it was still a long way to accept that defeat also meant liberation. Federal Chancellor Helmut Kohl had made clear his view of dealing with the past a few weeks before the Weizsäcker speech. Dealing with the past being rather a long, difficult German word, not an easy process in Germany. So Kohl was at a soldier cemetery in Bitburg, where members of the Wehrmacht are buried, but also some dead of the Waffen-SS. He tried to stand side by side with US President Ronald Reagan, talking about a 0 hour, which apparently marked the 8th of May 1945. Anything that happened before that date was relegated to a past that had been closed off and shouldn't really been talked about anymore. Weizsäcker made sure that political damage was limited for some, but not for everyone. In the right wing of its party, the CDU and the CSU, those who wanted to strengthen patriotism proposed another way of reading history. Franz Josef Strauss, then ministerial president of Bavaria, also stood up against the constant dealing with the past. We are made to feel that we have to that we are made to feel as losers of the war all the time. If Germans had to revisit that past all the time, it would not be good for Germany. For him and his conservative POS, he did not understand that the collapse of a state of injustice had also brought liberation of the continued influence of its ideology. Strauss concluded, and I quote, "We are a normal, strong, keen nation that had the misfortune to have terrible politicians heading it twice in a row." End of quote. Strauss then added, and I quote again, "Crimes were not just committed by Germans." End of quote. He also said that a people that had managed an economic miracle like Germany now had the right to move out of Hitler's shadow. The head of the parliamentary group in the Bundestag, Alfred Dräger, exposed himself most of all. His interpretation of history goes back to 1914, which initiated, and I quote, "a never-before-seen European catastrophe." End of quote. This somehow diffusely continued via the Treaty of Versailles all the way to the beginning of the Second World War, where at least German soldiers had fought honorably and German people had known nothing about the crimes of the regime. Nationalist bulwarks were also still defended in the 1980s. The controversy of historians and the Wehrmacht exhibition then finally paved the way to accept the metaphor of liberation alongside the television series Holocaust, which was broadcast in the end of the 1970s. In the GDR, the image of liberation of fascism was the central emblem of the anti-fascist political culture. But also in the Federal Republic, Richard von Weizsäcker in 1985 was not the first head of state who had proclaimed the understanding of liberation. One of his predecessors, the liberal Theodor Heuss, already characterized the 8th of May 1945 as a day of bitter defeat and at the same time a day of liberation in 1949. One of the most astonishing results of Allied occupational policy in Western Germany is the fact that the instruments and structures of democracy were accepted very easily, and how democracy was internalized as a form of life. Because the experiences of the decades that followed show that the rejuvenation of civic society, accepting a state of law and accepting a parliamentary democracy wasn't just something that sprang from servility of the losers of the war, but had actually become internalized as a conviction of the great majority of people in Germany. This is actually very important, more important than the inability to mourn, which is the title of a book that was quoted a lot, not read as much really. It's a title that gives expression to the feeling of that not enough was actually talked about National Socialism, its crimes and the victims, and how everyone was involved in all of that during the phase of rebuilding Western Germany. While that is right, there's also a generation that didn't know how to speak about this, didn't know how to reflect the catastrophe of the Nazi regime in Germany, that would rather push aside the terror than think about it. This is a generation that was really not able to deal with all of this. If that generation understood the end of the Nazi state in 1945 primarily as a defeat and disaster, was grateful for the end of the war, but didn't understand it as being liberated, at least that same generation did not oppose a reconstruction of a civic and democratic society. That is something that should be honored.
In the Soviet occupation zone that became the German Democratic Republic in 1949, anti-fascism was a state program, and it was the most important term of all political culture. It was a prerequisite for a new start. The Soviet military administration and the state party SED saw this as the prerequisite of all political and social life in the years of occupation. The citizens of the GDR thought it easier to perceive the emotion that they were liberated from fascism. There was a debate whether the anti-fascism of the GDR was just an order, but this debate does not make any sense because the citizens of the GDR saw themselves in a more moral position and in the system competition with the Federal Republic, they felt even better because they delegated everything that was bad to the Federal Republic, where the legacy of Hitler allegedly was flourishing, while in the GDR nothing was left of fascism. And this attitude is still alive after the reunification. The term defeat received new connotations with the end of the GDR. The current success of the party Alternative for Germany in the new federal states can also be attributed to this past. This party got successful with xenophobic mottos and a very small political program, actually. And many voters on the territory of the former GDR, however, voted for them because they are still experiencing a defeat by the reunification of Germany. Of course, the AfD is not only voted for by people in the former GDR, and not only on the basis of a sentiment of a defeat after the German reunification. However, there's a certain way of explaining their success in the East in that way. A historian who for decades had been a convinced Democrat. He had talked to American journalists, he had friends from Israel, Jewish friends from Israel and the US, and had always told them that the Germans, the Federal Republic of Germany, is a solid democracy. And he was convinced that the citizens had learned their lesson. And now this old historian was convicted of this attitude, and unfortunately, and this is my closing remark, this historian is very disappointed now because this conviction is no longer solid. Thank you for listening to me for such a long time. Thank you very much for your attention. Dear Mr. Benz, thank you very much for your keynote speech. Mr. Diener had to cancel his participation, and we are very happy that you agreed on short notice to deliver the keynote speech for our conference tonight. Thank you all very much for being here tonight, and now I would like to invite you to continue the discussion about the keynote and about our topic during a small reception in the room next. And I'm very much looking forward to this evening and the coming 2 days.